So let's talk about the value of value. Value is really just the artistic term for light and dark, but it's not quite as simple as that. Is this gray circle, is it light or dark in value? Well, the answer is it depends. Here, because the gray is on a white background, it appears to have a dark value. But if you take that same gray circle and place it on a black background, what happens? Now that gray circle appears to be light in value. You cannot judge any shape or color's value unless it's compared to a neighboring value. An area's value is relative lightness or darkness in a given context. Each of these gray circles reflect darkness or lightness of value only because they are lighter than or darker than the value of the surrounding squares. In reality, they're all the same 50% gray and appear identical until another value is placed next to it. So now we know that value can be judged only in context. And when we refer to value in a design, we are actually talking about value contrast. Not value, but value contrast. The circle at the far left in this scale is lighter than its background, and the circle at the far right is darker than its background. Both can be said to have a high value contrast or lots of value contrast. But what about the value contrast in the middle example? What about that circle in the very middle of this scale? Does it also have high value contrast like the ones on the end? There's very little contrast in values, and we would call this low value contrast. So let's look at these examples. A, is that high contrast or low contrast? Well, they seem to be pretty close in value, so I would call that low contrast. B, there's a little bit more contrast there, so that's high contrast. C is definitely high contrast. And D, once again, the values are very close, so that's low value contrast. These pairs have low value contrast, and these pairs have high value contrast. Did you know that the human eye can see up to 40 different values? I think that's incredible. So let's look at this photo. It's important to remember that only through differences in light and dark value contrast that we perceive forms. So let's look at these eggs and try to identify where the areas of high value and low value contrast are present. We don't have any trouble seeing that those are egg-shaped objects. But all of these areas seem to be high value contrast, and these areas seem to have low value contrast. So there's no perfect overall value contrast in this image. Lots of different places, but anywhere a value touches another value, you can rule that either high or low. And you're going to see the shape of a form better if you've got high value contrast. And just to make matters even more clear or confusing, if you will, there are words to describe the overall value in an entire image. So compositions that primarily use light values are called high key, and compositions that contain mostly dark values are called low key. In addition, it's commonly believed that degrees of value contrast can evoke different emotions. In this painting, you see high value contrast, and it seems to add to the drama and impact of the scene. So high value contrast implies drama. Here in this Morandi painting, and he painted most of his paintings just like this, they all look very similar. Low contrast in this painting seems to have a calming and serene effect, so you might want to remember that low contrast is more calming and less jarring. It's pretty easy to spot the differences in value contrast when the image is in grayscale. Obviously, the image on the left has low contrast, and there's much bigger or higher contrast on the right side. But when you add color into the mix, value contrast is harder to see. If you look at this quilt, is there high value contrast or low value contrast? Well, you don't really notice until you remove the color. When you remove the color, that's called desaturate. You see that there is very little value contrast. I might even call this whole composition low key. And sometimes, here's another Amish quilt, what appears to have lots of value contrast in color. This just seems to have lots of contrast because of the different colors. But in value, it has very little contrast. Mostly those little light areas that you see sparkling throughout the quilt. And here's another 19th century Amish quilt. Which is the darkest value of the three colors, the violet, the red, or the green? Most people say the violet, and I think I would agree with that. When you ask them where is the lightest value, they either pick the green or the red, and a lot of times it's the red because the red has a lot more saturation and it's more luminous than the green. However, when you remove the color, you see that the red and green are almost the exact same value. So you can't always judge value by looking at color. Now later in this course, we'll be talking about how colors have different inherent values. You can see from this translator that the reds and the greens are on different sides of the color wheel, but both fall in the middle of the grayscale or value scale.